Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this seminar in the history of collecting. And before we start, I'd just like to give some Zoom housekeeping rules. So firstly, just as we all know by now, to stay muted and with our camera off. And if you have any questions to ask the speaker at the end of the talk, to please put them in the chat option. Thank you very much. And now I will pass on to Suzanne, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks very much, Natalia. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wallace Collection's February seminar in the history of collecting. My name's Suzanne Higgett. I'm one of the curators at the Wallace Collection, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Sarah Ayres. Sarah Ayres is an independent scholar based in London and also a fellow at the Centre for Privacy Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Sarah studied for her doctoral thesis contexts of display for the late work of Gustav Klimt, 1908 to 1930, at Birkbeck College, part of the University of London. She's published part of her thesis in the Oxford Art Journal. Between 2016 and 2018, Sarah held the position of Queen Margherita II Distinguished Postdoctoral Fellow, supported by the Carlsberg Foundation at the National Portrait Gallery, London, where she worked on the sitter iconographies of Danish British consorts. She edited a special issue of the Court Historian, The Northern Line, representing Danish consorts in Scotland, England, and Great Britain, which was published in August 2019. With Elettra Carbone, Sarah co-edited Sculpture and the Nordic Region, a collection of essays about sculptural transcultural exchange between the Nordic region and the rest of Europe, which was published by Routledge in 2017. Sarah's led courses at the Wallace Collection on portraiture and also on metamorphoses in art and design. She's also a Wallace Collection volunteer guide lecturer. During and after Sarah's talk, as Natalia said, please send in questions and comments for Sarah through the Q&A. It's my pleasure to invite you, Sarah, to present your lecture, Descriptions of Collections and Their Display at the Stuart Court in 1669, in a manuscript account of Prince George of Denmark's Grand Tour, 1668 to 1670. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm presuming that you can. I hope that you can. I can't see anybody. But I would like to begin by thanking Suzanne and Natalia for the opportunity of speaking at the Wallace Collection seminar this evening. I have volunteered at the Wallace for many years and it's placed very close to my heart. So it means a lot to me to have the opportunity to speak at the series here on the history of collecting, many of which I've attended in the past. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Centre for Privacy Studies at Copenhagen University and the Nordea Foundation for supporting the research undertaken for this talk. And I would also like to hugely thank Charlotte Christensen and Paul Douglas Lockhart for their incredibly generous advice and corrections of my many mistakes in transcription and translation of the manuscripts that I'm going to share with you this evening. And finally, everyone attending for your interest in my little project. Ooh, what's happening to there we go. Okay. And my project is very much in progress, so I look forward to being able to discuss it with you in the chat and later in questions as well. So the text that I'm going to share with you this evening derives from two Danish language manuscripts written by Christen Jensen Lodberg as diaries of the Grand Tour of Prince George of Denmark, which survive in the British Library and the Danish Royal Library, Copenhagen. The Copenhagen manuscript is in 1 volume and the British Library manuscript is in 2 volumes. Prince George's Grand Tour lasted from 1668 to 1670 and included the Low Countries, France, England, and Italy. Within these manuscripts, Lodberg describes in great detail the various palaces, collections, cathedrals, universities, libraries, and fortifications visited by his princely pupil, alongside the lessons that he undertakes and the various personages encountered. Upon the death of George's father, Frederik III, the prince's suite was recalled and returned to Denmark via the German principalities. The London section of the manuscript comprises about 15,000 words and is largely the same between the Danish and the British Library versions. These fascinating accounts have never been translated into English, and so Lodberg's descriptions have largely remained unread for 3 centuries, at least by scholars outside of the Nordic region. In what follows, I will set the scene by describing the manuscripts. I'll give brief biographies of their author and their princely subjects. I was going to give a kind of quite a detailed overview of the itinerary, which runs from the 21st of July to the 11th of August, 1669. So George really just spent 8 weeks in England across those months. But I'm gonna ditch that because and we all know these Zoom talks can be quite hard work for listeners. So I'm just gonna ditch that, but please feel free to ask questions later on if you want to know more about the itinerary. So after this, then we're going to look very carefully at the 3 detailed descriptions of collections that George visited in London. Firstly, the Tradescants collection, which I acknowledge is not really a royal collection, not displayed in royal space per se, but it did include items with royal provenance. And moreover, I would argue that the detail with which it's described is very important to the way in which George, as a kind of a sovereign subject, if we can use that term, is framed by the text. But of more interest to scholars of the Stuart Court, perhaps, are Lodberg's very detailed descriptions of Hampton Court Palace and the Tower of London. So they will come very hot on the heels of the Tradescant collection. Okay, so first, a little bit of information about the manuscripts. While they are structured like a diary, they were clearly written up retrospectively to the events that they recount, and very much with their reader in mind. And as you can see, the hand is beautifully clear and very easy to read. A careful comparison between the Danish manuscript is on the left and the British is on the right. A comparison between these versions reveals that the London manuscripts are an edited version of the Copenhagen volume. And you can see that notes here are kind of scrawled across the Danish manuscript. Can people see my arrow? Okay. In this kind of very heavy sort of black ink. And the only way that I've been able to make head or tail of some of these very blobby kind of edits is by reading the English manuscript, the British Library manuscript. And it seems to me that the London volumes must have been a special copy created for the prince upon his marriage to Anne the First of Great Britain. George seems to have brought this copy of the diary with him to London, and it eventually entered the collections of the British Library. Rather than a neutral document of his journey, these texts must be viewed as complex representations created as monuments to their princely subjects and their expensive educational fashioning, which were primarily circulated among audiences at the home court. And diaries like this are very much a feature of German and Northern courts and were often produced as kind of monuments to their prince's grand tours, which were very widely undertaken as part of elite education. And so the result is a model of the making of the Baroque prince, forged in the Wunderkammer, tempered in the gallery, and polished in the diary. As Jill Beppler has noticed, these texts, such texts as this, were also addressed to posterity, forming a very important part of the dynastic archive. And so we have to be very careful to read these accounts as they are given to us. as a mixture of memory and representation. And this is not to say that we can't trust their contents, but we have to be careful in the way that we read what is given to us through them. And since Danish speakers at the London courts were presumably fairly few and far between, it's interesting to speculate how the London manuscript may have primarily functioned for George in its English context, as a useful work of reference, certainly, but perhaps also more emotionally as a keepsake of the prince's youth. And as we'll see later, although the BL manuscript is written in Danish, careful edits have been made which suggest that the writer Lodberg was concerned that it might not be an absolutely private document which would solely be used by the prince, but as something which might also fall under the curious gaze of others. Okay, so let's have a quick talk about the author. Now, as tutor, confessor, and author of these manuscripts, Christen Jensen Lodberg was doubly crucial to the fashioning of George as a royal prince of the House of Oldenburg. And he has quite an interesting backstory. He came from quite a poor farming family, but his father ensured he had the opportunity to attend Latin school. And he graduated from the Roskilde School in 1647, a little bit late because he had to keep going home and helping with the farm. After studying theology at Copenhagen University, he embarked on his own study tour in 1652, which was initially financed by a scholarship. After traveling through the Low Countries and England, he made his way through Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and France, where he ran out of money and had to enter military service for Spain for a couple of periods and managed to extract himself both times. He returned to Copenhagen in 1657 to take his master's degree, and then he travelled again as tutor to a young nobleman undertaking his own grand tour. He then taught at the Sorrow Academy before being called to court in 1665 to serve as tutor and confessor to 14-year-old Prince George of Denmark. There, prince and tutor undertook 2 years of study preparatory to their European odyssey. Much later in 1681, Lodberg became the Bishop of Ribe, and he continued in that capacity until his death. And it's certainly the case that we possibly learn more about Lodberg and his personality and his priorities, his concerns. These probably filter through the text to a much greater degree than does the personality of Prince George of Denmark. As we'll see, Lodberg makes little distinction between art and science, but there is some emphasis laid in his programme on technology and innovation in all fields. And he's also very concerned to assert the primacy of the word over the image as well. Okay, so Prince George of Denmark, this incredible waxwork now at Rosenborg Castle was actually constructed during his grand tour in Paris. So this is probably the best likeness of George taken during this time of his travelling. Now, George was born on the 2nd of April, 1653, the second son of Frederik III, King of Denmark, and Sophia Amalia, daughter of George, Duke of Braunschweig-Lüneburg. George's father, Frederik III, is notable as the king who introduced hereditary absolutism to Denmark. George's elder brother Christian inherited the throne as Christian V of Denmark. Like his father, George was a second son, and like him, his grand tour was intended to invest him with scholarly learning and courtly accomplishments, as Mara Wade has noted. But despite this expensive investment, Anglophone historiography has generally not been very kind to Lodberg's charge, with William Speck quite typically remarking that, and I quote, "Prince George is usually dismissed as a bone-headed nonentity," end quote. On the 28th of July, 1683, George married Princess Anne, the second daughter of James, Duke of York, and the future Queen Anne I of Britain. They were second cousins once removed through Frederick II of Denmark, whose daughter, Anna of Denmark, was Queen Consort to James VI and I, and we'll be meeting James and Anna later in Hampton Court Palace. George seems to have been very contented to play the dutiful, loving consort to Anne's queen regnant, famously declaring, and I quote, "I am Her Majesty's subject, I shall do naught but what she commands me," end quote. Tragically, of 17 pregnancies which the couple had, only one of their children, William, survived into boyhood, and he died at the age of 11. Members of George's marital court tended to be rather critical, as we've noted. Lord Dartmouth famously said that, and I quote, "Prince George of Denmark was the most indolent of all mankind," end quote. And furthermore, quoting again, "King Charles II told my father that he had tried him drunk and sober, but God's fish, there was nothing in him," end quote. Charles II's comments, as relayed by Dartmouth, seem to have somewhat overdetermined the historiography on George. But this is now beginning to be problematised, notably by Julie Farguson. A fuller account of the prince's education, especially in the Stuart and Bourbon courts, could substantially contribute to dismantling the helpful caricature which has largely obscured the complexity of George's dynastic role within his marriage and within Oldenburg and Stuart political history. In a letter dated a few short months before George's arrival at the Restoration Court on February the 5th, 1669, that's the date of the letter, Christian Lindenhof, the Danish ambassador to London, wrote to the Danish Chancery following a meeting that he'd had with the French ambassador to the court of St. James, Charles Colbert, Marquis de Coissy. And the Marquis de Coissy had suggested that an incognito visit, from George to London could take place during his grand tour, which had commenced the previous year. And this might be a useful means of smoothing diplomatic relations between the Oldenburgs and the Stuart Court, which had hit a bit of a rocky patch because of a series of missteps surrounding the exchange and reception of ambassadors. George's incognito status during his stay in England contrasts with that of his elder brother Christian, later Christian V of Denmark, whose own study tour to England in 1661 accrued the status of a state visit. And as part of my interest in the cultural significance and functions of privacy at court, I would like to do more comparative work on this in the future. But today we're going to focus on collections, the collections which George saw, and crucially, which Lodberg described in his record of the Prince's tour. And so I'm not going to do the itinerary. So I'm going to skip over. These are just some people that he met, but we're going to just skip over that and get straight to the Tradescant collection. And so in the afternoon of the 24th of July, George and his party arrived at the Tradescant collection. And so what I'm going to do now is just read out a translation of what they saw. Okay, so in the afternoon, saw a chamber of rarities on the other side of the hunting grounds, where various objects were to be found. Number 1, several coats of arms of the Knights Templar, Romans, Tartars, etc. 2, various rapiers, muskets, etc. Henry IV, King of England's rapier. Prince Maurice of Orange, his musket, an axe of stone. 3, American, a cowtail bigger in its hairs than any horse has had it in our country. And in the, I don't know why this is, but in the Danish manuscript, this intriguing cowtail is described as Arabian, but in the English version, it's described as an American cowtail, so it switches its geographical origin. Next, a Japanese sword, struck without fashion and shape, broader at the base than the tip. An Indian chair, small and made of iron. Indian garments, beds, as well as other costumes, among them Turkish, worn by those who are the descendants of Muhammad. And so this is the Danish library version, and you can see that it's the list very much in the way that I've been reading it out. It's just the list of items, like an itemization of the visit. Next, the costumes of the King and Queen of Virginia. And incredibly, the costume of the King of Virginia survives in the Ashmolean Museum today. And it's this object here, once thought to have been a cloak or a mantle. It's now thought more likely to have been a wall hanging, and it consists of 4 white-tailed deer hides trimmed and sewn together with sinew. And we can see this incredible shell beadwork decoration, which consists of a standing figure here, flanked by 2 animals, 2 4-legged beasts. The one on the left thought to be a mountain lion or a wolf, and the one on the right, a white-tailed deer. And these circuits could be settlements of the tribe or the tribes of the chiefdom. And so the text continues, item of Tartary. So this suggests that there's another royal costume, but perhaps drawn from Tartary. Lodberg continues, and furthermore, various rattling belts to wind about the body when dancing, as with castanets. Moneta de Galban, which are pieces of woven cloth of raffia. Moneta de Virginia, that are snakeheads sewn onto cloth and measured in ells. Boots of the tallest and smallest servants who were in the service of Charles I. A calamitous scene and skeleton worked in a drinking vessel, said to have been done for a king of India. Royal crown of India. Lap shoes. A rope which fastens the Tartar's costume. A boat from Greenland and the man's portrait who was captured with it. It is one of the boats which secures a man, and no water can come in. He is bound around the body. And this is interesting that this man and this canoe are said to come from Greenland. And we can see in the catalogue of the Traders' Camp Museum that a canoe like this is also listed, but here its subject and the subject of the portrait are Indian. And this is perhaps an indication that for the colonizer, the colonized subject acquires an amorphous, shifting, even ungraspable quality, which is not ameliorated by the documentation of that subject through his or her portrait. As Jordan and Ohala have noted, such slippages could also be absolutely deliberate. In just the same way that Britain and France used indigenous peoples and artifacts from North America as ways of staging their colonial power, so Sweden and Denmark, Norway too, elaborated their own colonial might by a similar usage of Sami peoples and artifacts. In fact, it's possible that the Tradescants Museum and its collections was received and understood by the Danish party in the light of Olaf Worms, and I'm really sorry for my pronunciation of all Nordic names here, which is just really dreadful, collection of Artificialia and Naturalia, the Museum Wormianum, sorry about that, in Copenhagen, which had been purchased by Frederik III in 1655. As noted by Mara Wade, Frederik III also sponsored several expeditions to Greenland in the years 1652 and 1654. In fact, in 1654, four Greenlanders had been forcibly captured and brought to Bergen, where their portrait had been painted for the Royal Kunstkammer. So it's interesting and rather sobering to see portraiture being used as a strategy here for colonization. And it's also interesting to see how that's a parallel technology used at both the Stuart and the Oldenburg courts. And so Lodberg continues, various fish among them remora, which is like a little sea fish about which they can say that it can detain a ship. And the remora fish is still called a remora fish today. It's a kind of a sucker fish. Lodberg continues, various birds, among others, also Scottish ducks that are grown on trees. And this Scottish duck appears in the catalogue as a barnacle goose. And it's interesting, why is Lodberg using this description of the barnacle goose, which derives from the medieval bestiaries, as growing on trees? A story which retained cultural currency well into the 17th century. Is this Lodberg's own descriptive choice? Is it an echo of a lost interpretive scheme, perhaps at the Tradescant Museum? Or is it the result of some kind of intervention of a guide? And so the text continues, various conch shells, among them one great one, which the Indians have used as a trumpet, like the Tritons are portrayed. Henry VIII's walking stick, Anne Boleyn's straw hat and gloves. And this is listed in the catalogue as being a kind of an embroidered silver silk knit ensemble. I'm not quite sure why it's straw in Lodberg's text, but I have checked it against several dictionaries, so definitely straw for some reason. Edward the Confessor's glove, 500 years old, Japanese paints and waxings, a hydra with many heads, most realistic, but only small, West Indian head ornament of feathers, etc., a portrait of Prince Maurice of Orange, of which every lineament was a text, written most subtly with a pen. This was a rarity. And here we see Lodberg's concerns really coming through. But if we read the catalogue, we can sort of make more sense of this kind of quite strange description, that the lines creating the portrait were actually tiny words, sentences, actual text. He continues, yet another portrait intricately composed of feathers, a victory wreath of teeth of the dead and defeated used in the West Indies. And again, this is slightly augmented in the Danish manuscripts here. In the Tradescant catalogue, we have instead a variety of chains made of the teeth of serpents and wild beasts, which the Indians wear. So that's seems like a less kind of dramatic catalogue description there. And then finally, in Lodberg's list, various insects, among which some that are called flying moles, carnelian of England, a beautiful piece, feathers from a phoenix's tail, reputedly, on which flowers go to the tip, otherwise rather greyish. And cabinets of curiosities and rarities, such as the one we've just visited with George and his party, are often represented and discussed as microcosms within encompassing or representing the macrocosm of the world. And George within the text here is very much presented as a microcosm within the macrocosm of the world that the cabinet represents. Within the cabinet, he's incorporating its knowledge, its richness, and its history, achieving a kind of integration with the material world, and at the same time, a kind of mastery over it as a kind of sovereign subject. And I'm going to be talking about these ideas, and I'm just doing this very briefly today, but exploring them in a lot more detail in a talk which is happening at the RSA a bit later in April. It's also bearing in mind, in relation to this description, that George's father, Frederik III, one of Denmark's greatest collectors, was actively investing throughout the 1660s in acquiring objects, not just the Olav Museum, for both Rosenborg Palace and a second building located opposite Copenhagen Castle, as Jorn Hein has shown. And given this ongoing project, the display and uses of collections in Stuart England was very likely of current interest to Danish court audiences. As we've just seen, the Tradescant collection is kind of represented within the manuscript as a world museum incorporating naturalia, ethnographia, and artificialia, which incorporate feats of skill in representation, and alongside the historic relics of former dynasties. Hampton Court Palace, which we'll visit next, is more of a kind of a dynastic palace Kunstkammer, showing the choicest pieces of contemporary and historic art collected by the Stuarts and their predecessors. And finally, the Tower of London, which we'll visit last, is a treasure chamber and an armory. And as Hein has discussed again, the classification and ordering of the Danish royal collections was at this time a hot topic. And so these English exemplars would have added to the conversation then taking place on the structure of the princely collections ornamenting the power and significance of the Oldenburg line in its newly absolutist incarnation. I'll skip over this, but this is just another example of a wonderful cabinet of curiosities here in Bologna, the Cosby collection. Okay. So the prince and his retinue went off to Hampton Court Palace on the 29th of August. And I would really like to thank Daniel Jackson and Brett Dolman of Historic Royal Palaces for their invaluable help with this section. On their help is very much dependent on their help. So thank you so much to them. And so again, I'm just going to read out the text, the translated text, just as Lodberg wrote it. Arriving at midday at Hampton Court, a palace or royal house lying 20 miles above London, by the hunting ground, an extensive and rambling house built first by Cardinal Wolsey, who also built Whitehall. It is built well in this fashion. Seen in the courtyard, a clock showing the course of the sun and the moon. Item, low tide and rising tide. It was said that a few days previously, there had occurred 7 times a low tide and a high tide in one day at Plymouth, as the gazettes had also reported. And so far, so familiar, as this clock, of course, remains in situ in Hampton Court Palace. We're all, I'm sure everyone that's visited remembers the incredible astronomical clock there. But after this, we return to a layout that largely no longer exists. And I'm indebted to Daniel Jackson for sharing with me this map of Hampton Court Palace at the time, more or less at the time, it's structured more or less at the time as we're visiting it today with George. And he also, incredibly, wrote this wonderful red line on it to show the route that we're going to be taking today. And I'd just like to show you within the manuscript this little kind of doodle, if we might call it that, within the margin. And I'm sorry that it's obscured by this little book snake here. But as you can see, these 2 square sections seem to correspond to the courtyards that we saw on the previous slide, and to the route basically that the prince and his party were taking. And it's quite deliberately done. I call it a doodle, but it's certainly not without thought. It's very deliberately inscribed within the manuscript, because this is also the Danish manuscript. So the doodle, if you want to call it that, or the marginalia, was transferred from the Danish version into the London version. And we can see that it corresponds to these courtyards here, and then the route as it goes through these sections here at the end. And so let's go back to the text now. After the courtyard clock, thereafter ascended to the king's chambers, and in the guard's room saw a painted whale, which appeared and was captured at Greenwich in the year in which Cromwell died. It was 60 feet long. Continuing on, thereafter 3 rooms. Next, the innermost antechamber before the bedchamber for the first rank of the nobility. Next, the king's bedchamber. Thereafter, 2 galleries, one small, within which 5 Doges of Venice were painted. And this small gallery is probably the backstairs gallery. If briefly go back. And these are the Doges themselves. And I'm indebted here to Brett Dolman, who has shared some incredible information from Hampton Court inventory of 1666, which gives a lot more detail about the different paintings which were displayed in different spaces. And so because he's helped me to cross-reference this text with that inventory, we can tell you that these are 2 of the Doges that were displayed in that backstairs gallery, in that small gallery, as Lodberg describes it. And here are 2 of the others. And this is the 5th Doge. And these portraits came into the royal collection via Sir Henry Wotton, who acquired them during his tenure as ambassador in Venice. And he then bequeathed them to Charles I in 1637. So alongside the 4 portraits, we also have this scene, which relates to a phrase in the manuscript, Confessus Donatus Veneti, which appears to show, well, which definitely shows the Doge Donato giving an audience to Sir Henry Wotton. Now, next, Lodberg takes us through to the large gallery, where we see the very famous portrait of Edward VI in perspective, which now is based in the National Portrait Gallery in London. Next, he records a painting of the Festival of the Bulls with a palace of Madrid. And this appears to be one of 9 Spanish landscapes, which Brett has noted as being recorded in store in the Hampton Court inventory of 1666. But as we'll see as we go through, all of these paintings which were then in store seem to have been got out by 1669 and hung around Hampton Court Palace. Next, the King and Queen of Bohemia with their children. While this painting seems now to have been lost, the children remain. And here's one. It seems that the portrait of the King and Queen may have been removed to Hanover by George I, but the children remain, and certainly these children were hung in that gallery in 1666. So this is probably what Lodberg and George saw. Next, Lodberg records then 2 young princes of Denmark, whose names they do not know. Certainly, they seem to be Queen Anna's brothers. And this could be, of course, Christian IV, Ulrich, or Hans. But we're not sure which paintings these refer to. Next, Lodberg writes, excellent maps placed on a great bookstand, one engraving of a man's height printed on thick paper in a binding, a fine rarity. The author was Sir Clerk. And while I've not identified this piece, this engraving of a man's height printed on thick paper in a binding, it seems that the engraver was Nicolas de Clerc, who certainly was renowned for his map making. And we continue. Nearby this incredible engraving, a painting representing Henry, the Black Prince of England, and the Countess of Salisbury, she sitting on a chair by a table with a knife in her hand, and will slay herself as he will not marry her, and he standing in wonder and dissuasion. Now, in the Danish manuscript, this scene is described as an historia vulgaris, possibly because of this little bit of the action down here going on with these little dogs. But in the British Library version, this has been edited. No longer Historia Vulgaris, now it's Historia Nota. And Brett noted that this whole Black Prince description is a mangled version of the scene in Shakespeare's Edward III, in which Catherine Grandison, the Countess of Salisbury, defends her honour against the king. And Brett points out the description that Lodberg is giving here absolutely fits the painting so perfectly. So could it be that this is in fact the subject of the painting, this scene from Shakespeare's Edward III? And it seems to be the case that for a very, very long time, the subject of this painting was absolutely not known. So perhaps we've solved this mystery. Perhaps we can discuss this in the chat or in the questions later. Now let's look at some furniture to switch things up. Lodberg next describes a cabinet inlaid with mother of pearl, showing Bible stories well carved. And although I don't have a picture of this, I imagine it to be extraordinarily similar to the famous Chirk cabinet, also known as the King's Cabinet. This is a mother of pearl. It's ebony with tortoiseshell inlays, silver mounts, and oil paintings on copper, which derived from the studio of Franz Franken II when it was under the stewardship of his son, Franz Franken III. And it's traditionally said to have been given by Charles II to Sir Thomas Middleton in 1661 in thanks for his role in the restoration of the monarchy. And cabinets like this were produced in Antwerp very frequently. And there's another very beautiful example in the V&A. So although I don't have a picture of this wonderful cabinet, we can imagine what it looks like, I think, from this example. Next, we have some more Spanish landscapes. El Entiendo de los Toros, item El Palacio de Madrid. Thereafter, a chamber where the king dresses himself after he retires from the Queen. And here this means when he retires from the Queen's bed. And so we are really getting a kind of an intimate insight into quite the literal, the material formation of the Stuart dynasty. Although, as we know, Charles II and Catherine of Braganza were not successful in this regard. Certainly, Hampton Court Palace seems to have formed part of the dynastic stage where their marriage was performed and undertaken. And in this room, therein was the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess in painting. And it seems that this may, in fact, be the painting of the Grand Duke, which Lodberg saw there. Thereafter, the cabinet of the king, whereof Parliament had sold the furnitures for £10,000 sterling. The king was killed. Now it contains a few pretty paintings. In passing, saw l'Escurial d'Espagne in painting. Next, saw rooms for use of the Queen, which one sees returning. First, a gallery. Therein, various paintings. Henry VIII, the Prince. The Danish word here is prinsen, which means the prince. And we would imagine this would mean Henry VIII is a prince, but I wonder if it also covers other kind of stages of a prince's life, even when he's a king. So this is the portrait of Henry VIII, which appears to have been in that space at that time. But of course, it's not Henry VIII as a prince. So again, a kind of a slippage that we need to sort of incorporate, that we need to take account of within the manuscript. But we can be a little bit more sure about the next one. Henry VIII, the Prince. The Duke of Buckingham, the favourite. I'm not sure whether this is the first or second Duke of Buckingham, so we're not sure about the portrait there. But this one, Duke of Richmond, the father of this one, this is definitely that portrait, which seems to have been hanging in this space at that time. And next, King James and Queen Anne. She stands with her elbow akimbo, and in the other hand, a brace of sighting hounds, 3 small hounds. They call her hunting queen. The prince had her physiognomy. Sorry, I can't say the word physiognomy today, physiognomy. And so here we see the text is really knitting Prince George of Denmark into the Stuart dynasty via this dynastic link constituted by Anna of Denmark and her consortship. And so it's really the way that Lodberg describes the succession of the portraits leads us to think that he's describing the hang, that they're sort of next to each other. And it's really nice to see here the way that the background, the hanging velvet in the background of this copy of Paul van Sommer's 1617 portrait of Anne of Denmark hunting in the grounds of Oatlands Palace. He's copied it here and changed the background to this beautiful hanging velvet, and this renders it a kind of a continuous background with Van Sommer's wonderful portrait of James VI I. So it's really nice to think of the way that was created. And although this copy is thought to have been made between 1630 and 39 for Charles I, I'm not sure at the moment. I don't know how secure the documentation of that dating is, and so it's very tempting to think that perhaps this portrait could have been made specifically for this hang. And if we continue through this hang, this is just the bit of the manuscript. I wanted to point this out, where she's referred to here as the hunting queen. I think that's a really nice way of distinguishing her consortship within the Stuart succession. And then it seems that hanging next to the hunting queen, Lodberg describes the reigning queen as Flora seated, which is, of course, this wonderful portrait of Catherine of Braganza. And again, it's really wonderful to think about the curatorial rhythms, again, created by this hang of these two consorts next to one another. And perhaps I'm being a little bit fanciful because I am a bit over-obsessed with this portrait and its various different versions. But I'd just like to point out the incredibly strong diagonal in both portraits' composition, running from the top left to the bottom right of the pictorial space. And also the kind of the echo of the way that the hat is framing the face. And also the way that the body is posed. Although Catherine of Braganza is seated, we get this kind of echo in the position of the elbow here, and then in the position of this arm along the body. And then maybe it's a little bit fanciful, but wouldn't it be incredibly witty if these little black and white dogs and these little black and white ducks were somehow interreferential, referencing one another? I think that would be really lovely if that were the case. So again, if maybe this is a bit too wild for me to be speculating in this way, but please let me know what you think. And so continuing on, thereafter saw the Queen's bedchamber, therein a wonderful and rich bed with tablecloth and chairs, all richly embroidered with gold, presented to the King by the Lords of the State of Holland, when His Majesty travelled through there, except the chairs, are of great value. Therein tapestries interwoven with gold, the histories of the New Testament. This was the finest of everything we saw there. Thereafter, the innermost antechamber, where the Queen holds the circle, in front of which there is a balcony from which one can see a fishing park outside, fashioned almost after the manner of Versailles. Thereafter, 3 other rooms, as for the King's antechamber, with better tapestries than those of the King's, though without gold. With the 3rd, a gallery assembled with deer antlers and fallow deer antlers. Here was to be found a monster, 2 great heads grown together at their upper parts and divided at the bottom where the nose and mouth was, but there were only 2 eyes and 2 horns. One of the horns belongs to a fallow deer, the other to a ram. The same goes for the 2 heads, the one of a deer, the other of a ram. And this is a fascinating description, and I just cannot imagine what it is. But I would love to. I would love to, if anybody knows of any kind of creation that fits that description, I would love to hear about it. There was a picture of the forest of Amboise measuring 2 feet in height, 9 in width, 5.5 in space, and there's nothing like that in the inventory for 1666, so that's also remains a mystery. Finally, coming into the guard chamber, where there were fine tapestries, of which one piece was spread out on the floor, woven with gold. It was said that 10 such pieces have cost £20,000 sterling. Seen thereafter in leaving the chapel, where there was nothing notable. After everything was seen, ate in a pub below the palace, and thereafter travelled to Windsor, 12 miles away, where Prince Robert is governor. That's Prince Rupert of the Rhine. But we're leaving the itinerary because of time. So let's rush on now to the Tower of London. And I'd especially like to thank Paul Douglas Lockhart for his incredible help in helping me decipher various bits of the text which were describing weaponry in this section. And these weapons were completely new to me, so I really needed his help. So thank you so much, Paul, for your help with this. And so on the 5th of September, the party drove to Whitehall and talked with the king. At midday, they were the guest of my Lord Oxford, probably Aubrey de Vere, the 20th Earl of Oxford. They were also with Gilbert Talbot and the Master of Ceremonies, and then they went to see the Tower, and they were accompanied by Christian Lindenoff, the Danish ambassador, Gilbert Talbot, and the undermaster of the stables, whom I've not been able to identify at the moment. And again, the manuscript gives us a list. Number 1, an armory with muskets and pistols. There saw the king's musket that he carried was 7 years old. The Duke of York, his musket. Item, a musket of Prince Rupert's invention. When you pull the trigger on a matchlock, the serpentine opens and brings the match to the pan. Saw the cannon house. Saw their cannon of 64 balls. This is an English Kartova, and I'm sorry about the pronunciation here. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but apparently it's a short and thick cannon. In addition, various others of different sizes and a French cannon. Saw the crown, the orb, and the scepter. The crown on a red velvet cap, trimmed around with ermine, which the king wears in the Parliament. On the top, next to the crossed arches, a great stone called aquamarina. Besides the former crosses of several stones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, etc., and everywhere set with pearls beside each of the stones. Thereafter, the orb with a circlet about it and a cross at the base of the circlet with stones, and on top of it, a cross of diamonds, just like that on the crown. Item, 2 scepters, the one with a curling pattern, probably this one that's spinnet chased here, and a cross of jewels, the other with a cross of silver gilt and a dove perched with outstretched wings. The one scepter is for peace, the other for justice. Saw an armory with armour. Therein saw the armour that the king was made in his 13th year, when he was with his royal father in the first battle in the former wars. Also an armour which the great Mogul presented to this king. Also saw armours for horses and armoured horses, various kings and princes. Charles I, Prince Henry, Henry VIII, Henry VII, Henry V, Edward III, William the Conqueror, and many more. And of course, this is the famous Lion of Kings, which remains in the Tower of London today, as does this wonderful armour, which was made originally for Charles I, but then passed down to his son. And we also have this wonderful portrait by William Dobson, in which he's shown wearing that armour. So that's, again, an incredible and fascinating survival. Next, an armour with Spanish weaponry taken by Elizabeth. There she held court to ruin the invincible fleet of Spain. Saw strange pikes. And here I'm very indebted to Paul Douglas Lockhart for helping me figure this out. Item, a shield with a gun inside, the barrel going right through the metalwork of the shield. And the one who used it had the lock in his hand inside. And so this is this incredible, I would never have imagined anything like this, but it's a gun shield with a gun running through it. So that's incredibly fabulous. Saw also there the axe which Elizabeth had made to behead her favourite with, the Earl of Essex. And this appears to be, or at least is rumoured to be, the axe. And finally, coming to the end here, saw moreover a mace with some guns inside, which Henry VIII had used. It is said that, this again is a fascinating piece, and apparently it's extraordinarily well documented. But again, something I would never have imagined: a mace, a spiked mace with 3 gun barrels inside. So it can actually be used to shoot people as well as hit them with. And so the text continues. It is said that within the tower there was 30 times 100,000 barks or barrels of gunpowder and weaponry for 50,000 men on foot and horse. It is the only munitions house in England. For the mint, next they go to the mint. And I'm sorry about the quality of the picture. This is the only image I could find of this medal. Therein saw a medal. On the one side, the king. On the other, a defeated fleet minted with a device, pro talibus ausis, signifying the battle that in the next year, that was signifying the battle that was won over the Dutch. Sorry. Item, saw where they separate gold and silver from one another. Item, where they cast the gold into long sheets for the mints. There was pistol gold inferior to crown gold. Item, where they weigh the gold. And the pistol gold and the crown gold refers to currency. So the pistol gold is Spanish and the crown gold is Danish. Thereafter saw the great beasts, terrible lions, one of which had belonged to King Charles I. Item, the present king, one of the others also belonging to this king, another to the Duke of York. And it's fascinating to me that various different lions are associated with the various different members of the royal house. There was a lion with a lioness, however, they did not mate. A lion with a dog in his pen, which he caressed. Saw there also leopards, male and female, tigers, all of great size, more than commonly seen. Thereafter, travelled home by water. And so this concludes our canter through the collections as described by this manuscript written by Christen Jensen Lodberg. And so now I'd be very grateful to take your questions, and thank you so much for your attention this evening.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. It was really fascinating. And we've got some questions here. Matthew Winterbottom asks, are there accounts of Prince George's visits to St James's Palace and Whitehall Palace?
No, there isn't, which is really disappointing, isn't it? And there's also no description of the Queen's house or of Somerset House. And certainly they go past Somerset House and they do see it, but it's not described at all. So that's very disappointing. But Windsor Castle is described, so that's something.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. And then Sally Cowan has asked a couple of questions. Did Prince George meet or stay with the royal family during his tour, or did he just visit their collections?
No, he hung out with them quite a bit. And certainly the first thing that they did when arriving in London, they were staying with Christian Lindenow, the Danish ambassador, and his letters are a very important source for this period. They went and reported their presence to the Master of Ceremonies pretty much straight away. They weren't able to see anyone else before they had reported their presence to the Master of Ceremonies. Charles Colbert tried to come and visit them, and they had to refuse the visit because they'd not reported their presence to the king. So straight away they do this, and then there's a lot of visits, a lot of interaction. At the end of the tour around around Stuart England, this little corner of Stuart England, there's a posh dinner with the King and the Duke of York. there's a lot of detail about all of this, which is really, really nice to read. And, you know, I would love to talk about that more, maybe at a different presentation. I should pitch some more work pitch some more presentations, I think, based on this manuscript, because it is so incredibly rich and detailed.
So I'll just pop in a quick question, if that's okay. I'm just wondering,
Yeah, sure.
if you have any plans to publish it?
Well, I've signed a contract for a book, which is titled Portraiture of Danish British Consort, 1600 to 1900. And the second chapter of that book will be on George and this manuscript specifically. But the publishers don't want massive appendices. So the transcription the London section is about 15,000 words. So transcription and translation is about 30,000. And I'm not going to be able to talk about all of it within one single book chapter. So I think it would be really, really nice to publish it as a kind of a critical edition, if there would be a market for that. So I am kind of interested in doing that. And if anyone's got any suggestions of publishers, I mean, it's far too long to go to a journal, but any ideas about publishers that might be interested in that kind of text, you know, please do let me know in the chat or through the questions. That would be great.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And then another question from Sally Cowan: are the paintings seen at Hampton Court still at Hampton Court, or have they been moved to other palaces?
Both. The Doges, which we saw, they're in Kensington Palace now, I believe. The Jan van Balkamp copy of the Paul van Sommer is in Scotland, and the original, if you will, Paul van Sommer portrait of Anne with her little dogs is now at Hampton Court Palace. Yeah, things have moved around. Things have moved around quite a bit. So, but because that layout which George visited is no longer there, it doesn't really make sense for all of those portraits to be in the same places that they would have been at that time. It's not possible because those rooms no longer exist. So I think understandably there have been some shifts and some changes.
And then Karen Hearn is asking, does it appear that Lodberg was using the printed 1656 Tradescant catalogue as a source for his manuscript?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I would be incredibly surprised if he didn't. Certainly, the party did buy books while they were in London, and they also bought a microscope. They also bought clothes as well. So if they hadn't have picked up a copy of that catalogue, I would just be incredibly surprised, really. So yes. I imagine that he probably did refer to it.
Thank you. And then Stephen King is saying, amazing research, thank you. Did the Prince visit Bath? Any reference of his maritime interests? Later, he was First Lord of the Admiralty. Were any plant samples acquired from Tradescant?
Okay, so I don't know about plant samples, but they did go to something called a spring garden, but there's no details of it given. And of course, they were at the Tradescant collection, where there was a big botanical garden there as well, I think. With regards to the maritime stuff, there's absolutely loads of it. So yeah, there are like huge lists of ships, and they go and they view the fleet. They look at various installations. Of course, they're at Dover. There's a lot of maritime stuff, and lots and lots of ships. A very long list of names of ships. So there's a lot of material there. I'm not familiar with maritime history really at all. So I'd be happy to share those pages with you if you're interested.
Thanks very much. And then Mara Wade has written, the production of a fair copy to take to England upon George's marriage suggests a very special role for this in the Stuart dynasty. Can you elaborate?
I wish I could. I think this is something that I'm continuing to think about, because the thing about this, the manuscript that was brought to England, it didn't focus purely on the London sojourn. I mean, there was also the French and Parisian section. And the French and Parisian section with the visit to the Bourbon court, that is the largest part of the whole manuscript. Also in the London manuscript, there's a section on Venice. The parties trip to Venice. Venice has its own special section, and that section is completely missing from the Danish manuscript. So I don't know entirely why it exists within the London copy. Also Italy is that's also a huge section. Both the French and Italian sections of the manuscripts are much longer and described in much more detail than the England section. The Low Countries are hardly described at all as well. So in terms of its dynastic role, I'm really not sure. I mean, the other problem is that it's written in Danish, and I'm not sure how many people would have been able to read it at the Stuart Court at that time. So this is a very weak answer to your very good question, for which I apologise.
And then Mara Wade has also asked, the idea of an emblematic reading of George as the homo microcosm is really interesting. I'm wondering if he visited Dresden on his grand tour.
It's highly possible. There was a lot of journeying through the German principalities. They definitely went to Augsburg. I don't know about Dresden. I would have to look it up. And of course, George went to visit his sisters. I think his sisters married into German principalities, and which ones escape me just at the moment. But he made a separate journey again to visit those sisters long after his grand tour was over. So yes, so Dresden is a definite possibility.
Right, and then we've got a question here that I think looks like it's from Natalia at the Wallace, thanking you for a great talk and saying that you mentioned that these descriptions were written retrospectively. Are there any diaries or documents that were actually written during the trip?
There do appear to be some notes in the Danish Royal Archives, in the Danish State Archives. So there are a whole load of notes associated with the tour. There are also some accounts, but the accounts are not very detailed, but there are accounts there. And there's also a kind of ancillary documents, like there's a diary that was written by George's Kammerjunker or page. This is very much a list of who they met on what days. So it's quite useful to cross-reference the Lodberg manuscripts with this diary that was written by the page, to make sure that you're getting the names and the people right on the right days. So kind of yes and no, I think is the yes but no is the answer to that question.
And Amy Lim is asking, do we know if Prince George bought any artworks or furnishings while he was in England, or was he just looking?
He definitely bought a microscope. I remember this from the accounts. Clothing, and they also bought books. I did look in the accounts to see if they'd bought any paintings or they'd commissioned any portraits of themselves or done anything of that nature, and it didn't seem that was the case. When he was traveling through the Low Countries, he did commission a portrait, but frustratingly, the accounts don't say who the portrait was by, or they don't give any details whatsoever. So it's just excruciating that I don't have that information. And I would really love to know about, there was a portrait that was made of George while he was in England. And again, this is really frustrating. I don't know whether with your knowledge of British art, you might be able to help with this, but on one day he went to a little house just on the outskirts of London that was owned by a Lord Berkeley. And there are three people whom this Lord Berkeley could be, and three different properties associated with them. One is Durdans, another is Twickenham Park. And on this kind of day trip, they painted George's portrait, or George's portrait was taken. But the artist again is not mentioned. I've got no idea who that portrait might be by, and I'm also not sure which Lord Berkeley they're referring to. So it could be one of three, I think. So it's just hugely frustrating.
Thank you. And then Jill Beppler asks, is there any indication that they made contact with members of the Royal Society or went to one of their meetings?
This is a great question, and there's a fourth kind of collection that the party visit. I mean, they do go to Oxford University and they do the whole Oxford University thing, but then they go to John Boyle's house in Pall Mall, which he shared with his sister. And this is described by Lodberg as a cabinet of rarities as well. And I understand that there was a laboratory on this site, and Boyle performed various experiments for visiting dignitaries, and George was certainly one of these. And they performed 3 experiments for George in this space, something called the changing of the colours, something called a Magdeburg experiment, and then a Torricelli experiment. And it's all described in a lot of detail. And there's also various instruments and rarities which are there as well, which they look at. So that they certainly do that. And to my mind, this is kind of like a fourth collection, which is kind of educating George and fashioning him as a kind of a contemporary prince at the cutting edge of science within the text. So I know that Boyle's work doing that has been really well documented, and there's a lot of work on it. So there's a lot of more information to draw on. So definitely they were very interested in science. The Lodberg is interested in science throughout the manuscript. Science constitutes a really important aspect of the tour.
Fascinating. And then a question from Tim Schroeder. Does the account say anything about the jewel house other than the regalia? It makes one wonder if the regalia were kept separately from the rest of the gold and silver plate, and perhaps the visitors weren't shown the rest.
Yeah, I've given you everything. So I just read it out exactly as it's written. So it is interesting, isn't it, in terms of how that whole experience must have been structured. So it's a really good question. I don't think I have a good answer for you.
And Elias Hall asks, interesting question, did they also visit historical sites, so to speak, ruins or ancient monuments?
There's the cathedrals. So they go to Canterbury Cathedral and they do the tombs and the monuments there and all of the architecture. And of course they do Westminster and they do the cathedral. There's a really great description of the Henry VII Chapel and all of those spaces, just really nicely done. They go to Westminster Hall and look through the various different chambers of the Houses of Parliament, the Painted Chamber, the Upper House and the Lower House. I'm not sure if these constitute the kind of the monuments that you mean. Perhaps you mean kind of Stonehenge and that kind of thing, but no, they don't go to Bath or Stonehenge or do that. At all. So there's no kind of ancient ruins or ancient monuments really that are mentioned within the text at all.
Thank you. And then Andrew Burnett is wondering, how influential was the visit and trip elsewhere on George's own collecting?
Well, we don't really know anything about George's collecting, and there's literally one thing surviving in the royal collection today which has a connection with George, and it's a beautiful standing clock. And apart from that one single object, nothing is really known about George's collecting. So of course Julie's written her book recently, so that's Julie Ferguson. She's written on this period and George and Anne, so that would definitely be an important source to consult. But as far as I know, within the royal collection proper, it's just really that one clock that survives, which we know about. Although I know that Julie consulted a lot of inventories for her book, so definitely have a look at that. Thanks,
that's really helpful. And then Edward Cheney is saying, I may not have been concentrating adequately, Ray, the painting of Edward III and the Countess of Salisbury. Was it described as depicting Shakespeare's play? Because I don't think the play was attributed to him yet, question mark.
No, should we go, can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Let's go back. Whoops. No, the text does not mention Edward III at all. It doesn't mention Shakespeare at all. It just basically describes the scene. It describes, it identifies this woman as the Countess of Salisbury. That's it, just the Countess of Salisbury. And this gent here is the Black Prince. So when I was discussing this with Brett at Hampton Court Palaces, he said this is likely to be this scene from Edward III by Shakespeare, but it's kind of like a garbled version. So it's interesting that the play wasn't attributed to Shakespeare at that time. So I don't know anything about this. Who was it attributed to? Can you, is it possible to tell us in the chat or?
Well, Edward could perhaps think about that. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but Edward, if you have any more information, maybe you could type it in while I just read out a question from Matthew Winterbottom. Is the account of Windsor Castle quite detailed?
It's not too bad. It's fairly detailed. It focuses very much on St. George's Chapel, and of course they want to be in there because Frederik III was one of the Garter knights, and so they want to go and see the coat of arms, so that's important. And they also see the grave of Charles I as well, so that's very important to them. And they also see various portraits and yeah, the Round Tower. So it's very much what you would expect.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And Edward hasn't come back to us, so just like to thank you very much indeed for a really interesting talk, followed by some fascinating discussion in response to the questions that came in. So thank you very much indeed. And our programme for the History of Collecting seminars for 2021 is now available, and it's been sent out to people on our History of Collecting mailing list. So if you'd like your name and details to be added to that list, please contact us at collection@wallacecollection.org. That's all run together, all lowercase, collection@wallacecollection.org. Our next seminar in the History of Collecting will be on Zoom at 5:30 on Monday, the 29th of March, when Janet M. Brooke, an independent scholar from Montreal, Canada, will give a presentation on the Gilded Age in Canada, reconstructing the life and afterlife of the Sir William Van Horn collection. So once again, Sarah, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. And on behalf of the Wallace Collection, thank you very much for attending this seminar. We hope to see you at future seminars and at other online Wallace Collection events. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.